I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. We gather virtually today to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day. We hope you're staying warm and safe in this frigid weather. I regret that we couldn't host this in person at the museum, but I'm glad to see so many of you with us online. On January 27, 1945, Soviet troops liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest Nazi death camp. Between 1942 and 1944, over 1 million people were murdered there, the vast majority of them Jews. 5 million more European Jews were murdered across Nazi-occupied Europe in death camps, by mass shootings, on death marches, and within ghettos and concentration camps. Under the cover of war, the Nazis and their collaborators also persecuted many others: prisoners of war, people with disabilities, Roma, Sinti, and Lalari, homosexuals, political dissidents, and resistors of all faiths. In 2005, the United Nations designated January 27th as a Remembrance Day to honor all the victims of the Holocaust, men, women, and children who committed no crime other than being born a certain way or fighting back against the Nazi regime. In its resolution, the UN urged member states to reject Holocaust denial and promote education to prevent future atrocities, with a goal to preserve this history and prevent genocide from occurring again. At the museum, we work toward this objective every day through our mission to teach the history of the Holocaust and advance human rights to combat prejudice, hatred, and indifference. By joining us today, you are helping us fulfill our mission to educate and engage our community through the stories of survivors, victims, and upstanders. We can all be upstanders. I would like to take a moment to thank our community partners for today's program: the Jewish Federation of Greater Dallas, the North Texas Disability Chamber, and the Texas Holocaust, Genocide, and Anti-Semitism Advisory Commission. I'd also like to thank all of our supporters watching this program today, our museum members, board members, volunteers, and generations. We are very grateful for your steadfast dedication to our museum and our North Texas community. This leads me to recognize a vital group of people in our community, our Holocaust survivors. These women and men are the heart and soul of this museum, and they remind us every day of the best of humanity. I would now like to recognize the survivors who we lost this past year: Frida Alperovich, Brigitte Friedman Altman, Yakov Bershadsky, Ina Bailina, Mikhail Kargalitsky, Nina Kakov, Hannah Katz-Klein, Vera Portnaya, Yakov Rabinovich, Sophia Rivshina, Bert Romberg, Zenaida Voskoboynik, and Helga Wolf Weinstein. May their memories be a blessing. Today, we are honored to welcome survivor Marion Ein Lewin and award-winning author Faris Cassell. Faris is the author of Inseparable, the Hess Twins Holocaust Journey through Bergen-Belsen to America. Her first book, The Unanswered Letter, won a 2021 National Jewish Book Award and an American Society of Journalists and Authors Biography Award. Cassell earned her MS in journalism with honors from the University of Oregon and her BA in history from Mount Holyoke College. Marion and her twin brother, Stephen Hess, were 6 years old when they were taken by the Nazis from Holland to Bergen-Belsen, where they endured brutal conditions and lived in a state of fear. The twins and their parents were imprisoned there for approximately 1 year and then forced by the Nazis onto a train, taking prisoners further into Germany. They were liberated by Soviet soldiers on April 23, 1945. And immigrated to the United States in 1947, reaching New York Harbor on New Year's Day. I would now like to turn it over to our two special guests to share the story of the Hess family. Faris will start us off, followed by Marion. And as always, we'll have time for audience questions at the end of their presentation. So please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen at any time. We'll get to as many questions as possible. Faris, please take it away.
Greetings. Thank you, Mary Pat, and also Caroline for the kind welcome. And thank you all who are zoomed in. I hope warm despite the severe weather around the country, and surprisingly in Dallas. The weather perhaps not unlike our own unsettled times. I'm grateful for the work of this wonderful organization, and especially today, the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. But today, we will be taking you away from your comfortable homes and lives to one of the darkest places and times in human history. Rest assured, though, we will bring you back with, I believe, inspiration and hope, despite our uncertain world. We've all heard about genocides, and some of them quite recent. In Rwanda, Darfur in Sudan, the Rohingya in Myanmar, the Uyghurs and other Muslims in China, to name a few. These are happening in current times under military dictatorships, but in countries far from us. Why do we care about these distant disasters? Why immerse our hearts and minds in such darkness? I had asked myself these same questions as I began writing about the Holocaust, which is now nearing a century in the past. I began to learn what had happened and why it is crucial that the world do understand. Inseparable, as Mary Pat said, is my second nonfiction book about the Holocaust. In spring of 2021, I just finished 30 or so talks about my first book, The Unanswered Letter. I thought I was done writing about and living with stories from those dark times. Coincidentally, though, that spring, Marion Hess wrote an op-ed for the LA Times expressing her admiration for COVID workers for their resilience and selflessness, risking their lives to help others in need. They reminded her, she wrote, of Jews imprisoned in the concentration camp Bergen-Belsen, who courageously helped each other as they could to survive. Marion knew about the prisoners of Bergen-Belsen. She knew about the barbed wire, the huge piles of dead bodies there, because she and her family were survivors of that camp. A Times reporter then wrote a story about the Hess family, which came to my attention through my publisher, who asked if I might consider talking with Marion and her twin brother Stephen, and perhaps write their story. I spoke with them and learned the outlines of their history, and I knew this is a story important for the world to hear. A note here, I will sometimes use the term Holland in this talk because it was the term most commonly used by people in this story, though Holland is just one region of the Netherlands. There were plenty of challenges as I plunged into the research. The first, logistics. I was writing during a different kind of darkness. COVID was rampant. No one went to grocery stores or held meetings. My standard had been to interview people in person whenever I could, with the goal of understanding them in the deepest possible way. Marion and Stephen Hess, in their 80s, lived hundreds of miles apart in Upper New York and the outskirts of Washington, D.C. I'm from Oregon. During COVID, airlines struggled to fill even the few flights they hadn't canceled. And so I began the lengthy process of learning about Marion and Steve and their parents, Carl and Ilse Hess, German Jews, who were facing a murderous, racist, demented tyrant. I devised a system of phone and Zoom calls and emailed questions for Marion and Stephen to respond to. Steve's replies bounced back quickly. They were filled with facts and figures and intensity. Marion's replies, well, Marion, sometimes they took a while, but they tended to be deeper about their feelings and their relationships. Her emails were often poetic. Amazingly, Marion and Steve also had photos of their family taken before the invasion. Over our 2 years of working together, we exchanged well over 100 emails. In addition, the twins sent me the short memoir their father had written immediately after the war ended in Europe, when the Hess family was safely back in Amsterdam. Carl wrote it in the form of letters to his family in America, who were frantic to find Carl and the family. "Are you safe?" they wrote to him. "Where are you?" They wrote to the last address they had had for him, but they had been out of touch for 3 years. Also, I found testimony about the Hesses experience that Ilse had given at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And so I had first-person voices for the whole family, despite not meeting any of them in person. I worked often through the night, hearing their voices, building their story, and I began to put the pieces together, a giant jigsaw puzzle. But I knew it would not be complete without context. Why did Hitler invade the Netherlands, a tiny country that had remained neutral and safe during World War I? That invasion decision, made by Hitler himself, was the linchpin in the Hesses Holocaust experience. So I wove into the story the geographic, military, and political context that drove everything about the Holocaust. Those 2 years of calls and emails when I gathered information, that doesn't include the time we all spent editing and checking constant facts. I interviewed the Hess family members and dozens of experts about the Holocaust, including historians at the Holocaust Museum in D.C., the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam, Holocaust centers in Germany and Amsterdam, and relatives of those who had known the Hess family in Amsterdam. All this support built their story so that a reader can rely on its truth. And always on my mind, that Holocaust deniers who still unbelievably exist, so they can't say, no, this is fiction. The story begins in Germany, 1935. Karl and Ilse Hess were newlyweds when Hitler was solidifying his power. Karl was a successful businessman with a German-based international textile company, United Silk. She was the vivacious only daughter of a prominent Jewish family from Recklinghausen, a small city near the Dutch-German border. Ilse's parents worked as manager and buyer in a large department store there. Ilse sometimes accompanied her mother on trips to wholesale houses in Berlin to select women's clothes. Life had been good. They were well integrated into the culture, until the increasing terror of Hitler's tyranny put them on edge. As we all know, Hitler crushed dissent, closed what he called fake news sources, and established his own news outlets so that his voice and his message reigned supreme. He established police forces, including paramilitary groups he called the SA and SS, answerable only to him, who then rounded up, often murdering anyone who did not declare loyalty to him. He also rounded up religious groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses, though he did not murder them because, he once said, he admired the courage of their beliefs in not bowing down to anyone except God. But probably more likely, because that would have raised an uproar in the population. But the focus of his racial hatred and his terror campaign was the Jews. In that tumultuous, dangerous time, many German Jews fled Nazi terror, seeking a safe haven in the few places around the world willing to take the flood of refugees. Holland had been neutral during World War I. The young couple saw the writing on the wall. As their lives in Nazi Germany deteriorated, they decided to flee to that supposedly safe place. In 1936, Karl had his good job promised to him in the Amsterdam office of United Silk. At the time, this seemed a reasonable place for their safety. They decided to flee while they could. It was not too far from Ilse's family, just across the border, but away from Nazi clutches. Amsterdam had been a busy seaport with constant passenger travel to Britain and elsewhere. That option, they reasoned, would still be available should they need to run further. Thinking about their dilemma, what to do, where to run, and when, I'd like to ask you all to imagine a tyrant holding power in our own country, threatening your life and your family. Would you leave home? How far would you go? Or would you stay and fight that regime? Karl and Ilse sought safety, but Ilse's parents would not leave their home. Ilse wanted to be near them, and so they joined the flood of Jews entering Holland just across the border. Karl left first to begin his new job and find an apartment. He had no trouble crossing the border because of his job transfer with a German-based company. Ilse, however, had the treacherous task of traveling alone with their belongings under severe Nazi scrutiny. Penalties for illegal crossings or smuggling valuables out of the country were at the least imprisonment or being shot on the spot. Despite this fearsome threat, her efforts bring a ray of light into that dark time. First, Ilse needed to secure an exit visa. That required, basically, a where's the money interview with Nazi officials. Accompanied to that appointment by their accountant, Ilse wore her most fashionable outfit, including a hat with tall feathers. Here, you might want to think about, have you ever seen those hats that women used to wear, or seen pictures of them? They were really, really spectacular works of art. So she was bold to do that. When the German inquisitors accused her of hiding a large bank account, her accountant laughed. He said, "Look at her. She spends all of her husband's wealth on expensive clothes." The officials, all men, laughed and granted her visa. But then Ilse needed to travel across the Dutch-German border, bringing her very valuable jewelry, diamonds, rubies, and sapphires, bought with foresight as a hedge against possible threats to their safety. Fearless Ilse, who always dressed respectably, put on a short skirt, fishnet stockings, heavy makeup, and she simply pinned their priceless jewelry to the black velvet lapels of her red jacket. At age 22, this resourceful, beautiful, and courageous young woman crossed the border, facing Nazi inspectors with no problem. She later laughed. "They thought I was a 10-mark hooker, and my diamonds were costume jewelry." Marks, you may know, are the German currency, were and still are a German currency. Now that's an experience worth imagining. 2 years later, Marion and Stephen were born in Amsterdam. This was a beautiful time for Karl and Ilse. They felt safe. They took their twins to the beach and were happy. They thought they had found peace and security. Ilse's mother was given permission by the Germans to visit for 1 day, but not overnight. It was a glorious, if brief, family reunion. Ilse's father was not permitted to come, also for fear that he and his wife would escape together, eluding Nazi clutches. He would die, however, a few months later, protecting their local synagogue in the murderous pogrom known as Kristallnacht. That visit would be the last time Ilse saw her mother, later deported and murdered in a concentration camp. All the Hesses' plans and dreams fell apart on May 10th, 1940, when Germany invaded the Netherlands. Originally, Hitler's war plans had not included invading Western Europe. He'd imagined Germany expanding only to the east through Poland to gain access to northern seaports and Poland's wealth. Yet, moving with lightning speed, England, France, and Poland abruptly formed an alliance to halt that expansion of German power. Hitler had believed that the British and France would not go to war against Germany's massive military machine, to protect only what had never been part of the British Empire or in the British or French interests. And yet these allies did declare war, causing, so to speak, the dominoes to fall. Hitler then needed to control the entire Atlantic coastline, protecting Germany from its new enemies. What had been an Eastern European war expanded westward through Holland, then south to Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. As war exploded, the Brits and other foreigners in Holland and hordes of Dutch people fled to the ferry docks, desperate to catch the last boats to England. A British ship that had been docked in Amsterdam managed to carry the Dutch Queen Wilhelmina and the Dutch treasury of gold and spectacular jewels to Britain, just as the Germans closed in on the palace. Dodging falling bombs, the Hess family ran to their car and joined the mad rush for safety. But they were halted on the docks. Because they were German natives with only German identification, they were considered possible Nazi spies, refused passage, and sent back. The invasion and occupation of Holland proved to be a short war by land, air, and sea. The German military Goliath made short work of its much smaller, ill-prepared neighbor. Thousands of frantic Dutch fled across the border with Belgium. Cars, trucks, even bikes and baby carriages loaded with what people could quickly pass raced against time, only to find the German military in Belgium too. And then the terrified hordes ran further to France, where the Germans made relatively short work of that nation also, partly with the support of aging military leader General Philipp Pétain, now infamously known as a collaborator with the Germans and responsible for the deaths of thousands of Jews. The Hesses were trapped, with nowhere to run, once again, Jews struggling to survive under Nazi German tyranny. And so, Marion, would you like to continue?
Okay. Well, good afternoon. I'm delighted to be part of this program. And I'm sorry that we're not there in person, but we certainly are there in spirit. And I also want to thank Mary Pat and Carolyn and the rest of your staff who have been so gracious and patient as the scene of this meeting has continued to unfold because of the weather. There's always something unpredictable that happens in our life. I've been asked to show you some slides that we collected at PowerPoint to really illustrate what Faris spoke about. And speaking about Faris, my brother and I and our family give her such enormous credit for putting this book together with such expertise, with such dutifulness in being such an excellent historian as well as a writer, and my brother, my twin brother, who is well in Rochester, but there they have even more snow. He's one of these people who has read every book about the Holocaust. He's really a Holocaust scholar in his own right. And he has always been fearful about people writing about the Holocaust because he feels that there are still so many people who are Holocaust deniers. And if they see one sentence in a book that doesn't ring true, that doesn't seem accurate, they kind of denounce the whole book and the whole story as having been fabricated and not really true. So we were really lucky to have Faris be the author of this book. And she has, she's really made the story that we've held in our hearts and minds for so many years a gift to not only my family, but those of you who've had a chance to read it. And I never consider it my book or my brother's book. It's if you read the book, it's really an ode, a toast to my parents, who were incredible heroes and whose story deserves telling in this troubled world when we look for people who do the right thing, even if life is so precarious and the risk of you losing your life in horrible ways is with you every single moment and every single day. So in any case, the slides really summarize our story, the one that Faris just told you, but let me go through it. I don't want to take too much time because I always think the best part about these presentations is hearing your questions. So I'm going to try to keep it short. So here's my mother when she had us, twins. And now twins are everywhere. And there's so many twins that are born each year. But actually, when we were born, now too many years ago, twins are still unusual. They were kind of rare for people to have twins. And so my when my when we were born, actually, went to the hospital, and there was just my mother and my father. And my father was older than my mother, and he was used to peace and quiet and order. And when we went home from the hospital, there was not only my mother and my father, but myself, Marion, and my brother, Stefan, he was called at the time, and a nanny. And my father looked, he said, we went to the hospital and it was just the two of us. He looked at my mother, and now there are five of us going home. And so the first night he decided to stay in a hotel to get used to his family. But he was a great and very loving dad. And so here on the left is my parents during their honeymoon in Switzerland. And I just want to show you this because it was really, the rise of Hitler was already apparent. It was already an important presence, a threatening presence. But, people who were assimilated, people who loved their country, people who felt loyal to their country, people who were doing well in Germany, they didn't realize what would really happen. It's hard to put your arms around impending tragedy, impending horror. And so they felt this was just a crazy man who wouldn't last very long, and they would be able to stay in Germany and lead a good life. This one to the right is to my right, a precious picture because it's the only time my mother's parents, who were in Germany, were able to see us. And we were very young, we were under a year old. And we, of course, never saw them again. And my mother, of course, never saw them again. And, now that I'm over 80 and this experience happened a long time ago, and I think about it still clearly, forget it. the thing that I always think about is what was it like to be in a world like my mother, who was in her 20s, um, and to not have any idea where your parents are. There's no way you can reach to them. There's no way that you can have any idea where they are. That seems so improbable and impossible now in this age with phones, technology. And this, of course, was the fate of so many people who went to camp, separated from their family, separated from their mothers, their fathers, their sisters and brothers, never, never knowing what happened to them. And then after the war, still not knowing what happened after them, my mother had to put ads in the paper. And for a good year, she still never knew what happened to her mother. My grandfather had died during Kristallnacht. And so I think, just that's one of the side tragedies of the Holocaust. How many people who were there under the worst circumstances, fighting for another day of life and not even having any idea where their loved ones were. It was a world of voidness, of darkness. Okay, let's go to the next page. These, I guess, were still in the good old days. So there was my father, and there was my twin brother in 1941. And here was another one of the two of us. Now, this is another miracle. Why do we have these pictures? When I speak to some of the few friends I have, or few people, acquaintances who were in the camp or who were in the war, not necessarily at Bergen-Belsen, one thing that they regret that they have no pictures. And we were so enriched that that someone saved these albums for us. And it's so sorry. Sorry. What happened was we had a wonderful nanny, and I should really have put this. Okay, I'm very sorry about that. What happened was we had a wonderful nanny, and when my parents saw the writing on the wall, they gave some of their belongings to their friends, mostly non-Jewish friends, to hold for them, thinking that they would come back to Amsterdam, where we were living. And they gave the nanny kind of a big suitcase, and it held tablecloths and linens that were handmade in my mother's family, and they were very beautiful and very precious, and then some silver, but also the family albums, because my grandmother came from a family of 21 children. So even though my mother was an only child, she had this instant amazing family and every weekend she was all put on a train because the towns were very close together. And she visited her cousins, 21 of them. 18 survived birth, but then at the end of the war, there were only 3 left. But she remembers all these people, and my grandparents, were very hospitable and always had celebrations for Hanukkah and the Jewish holidays. So that they had all these albums. My father was a wonderful photographer, so he took pictures of his family, which was always so pretty large. And these albums were returned to us after the war. And when I think about what precious things we lost during the war, of course, lost everything, all the jewelry, all the possessions. But I always say to myself, but what was saved for us was so precious, beyond, had no dollar sign because they were priceless, that I grew up with these pictures. Not only those, but of all these relatives who I never had a chance to meet, who I never had a chance to see. And that was a legacy that is still precious to me. And all these albums are in my closet. Okay, let's just continue. So this was, um, it's interesting. I grew up, well, I'll tell you a story. When we came to this country in 1947, we were 9 years old, and I'd never been to school. My brother had never been to school, and we landed in Manhattan, and we started in kindergarten. And so I was very eager to learn and to be in school. But the first year we were in New York, almost every week we were feted by lunch at Eleanor Roosevelt's house, kind of reception for us at the United Nations, the mayor of Chinatown, the mayor of New York City. So there were so many days that we missed school. And one day I came home to my mother and I said, we're so old for our grade in school, but yet so often we're not there because we're taken here and there. And my mother would say, well, they want to do lovely things for you because here you came to America and you survived the Holocaust. You're a Holocaust survivor, and they want to honor you. And so at this age, kind of at 9, I said to my mother, I don't want to be known as a Holocaust survivor. I want to be known as an American girl. So that was many, many years ago. But I always had that dichotomy, which was, it was such a gift to come to America. My parents felt that they could start anew, and we would all turn the new page. And America, the land of the free, a place that everyone wanted to go to. And so I wanted to kind of look ahead and be an American girl. So for many years, I've had this conflict, and it's only really in the last few years that I've ever even spoken about my background. My good friends, when this book came out, just had never even known about my story. So a tradition for this was during COVID, when I wrote this op-ed piece for the LA Times, which was followed by a longer piece about twins photo unlocks Holocaust mystery. And this picture is a little bit iconic, which is a nanny, the wonderful person who hid the albums with our pictures, always wanted us to dress in native Dutch costume. She came to work still, even she lived outside of Amsterdam, in Dutch costume. And so my parents finally relented and said, okay, we will have this official portrait of Stephen and Marion in Dutch costume. The costumes, by the way, came from her family and were handmade. And the interesting story was when this picture appeared, LA Times reader identified the costume, knew exactly where the costume was made, in the little place that was a fishing village. And so, that in itself kind of resonated, and articles were written about us and this a story, and this picture kind of was in all the newspapers. So that's us. That was the last picture that was taken, because a few months later we were taken away to Westerbork and Bergen-Belsen. Okay. So almost all the Dutch Jews, when they were picked up, were sent to a Dutch camp, still not in Germany, but on the border with Germany, Westerbork. It was a holding camp, a detention camp, and from there people were sent to the concentration camps. And I remember, the thing is, you enter a world where you have no idea what is going to become of you. It's all secret. Of course, the Nazis didn't want people to know that they intended to murder them and kill them. I mean, then they would have revolt on their hands. So the whole idea was to keep people placid and peaceful, even though the conditions where we were worse and worse. But So this was a place that was survivable in the beginning. And the trouble was with both Westerbork and especially Bergen-Belsen, one reason that Bergen-Belsen especially became truly death camps is because, they grew so much. At first, there were only a few people, but then at the end of the war, for example, Bergen-Belsen was built for 7,000 people. And at the end, when it was liberated, so to speak, it had 70,000. And of course, then conditions become totally unlivable. The most frightening memory, and I remember it so well, I guess no one can forget that. But in the middle of Westerbork, there was a railroad track. And every Tuesday and Thursday, the train would come. People would have no idea where these trains were going to. But every day, at the end of the day, a list would be read out, maybe 300 people, 400 people, 500 people. They were very specific, the Nazis, in kind of detail. And so if 650 people were on the train, it could not be 651 or 649, it had to be 650. So these people were called out and then had to appear at the train track the next morning. And I remember even as a little girl hearing the wailing and the tears and the fear and the horror, because as I said, it was a mystery. People had no idea where they were going. It was only after they were never heard from again that people started having the sense that there was something horrendous and unspeakable that was happening to these people who left Westerbork. So let's go on. I just don't want to take too much time. So we went to this camp in cattle cars, which of course had no food, no water, no heat, no beds, and they were packed to the gills. So very often, even the trip from Westerbork to Bergen-Belsen was a short one, but to Auschwitz, to some of the further camps in Poland, people, of course, died on the train from just having nothing to eat and nothing to drink. When we were liberated on the lost train, and that's the end of our story, when we were liberated by the Russian army at the end of the war, a third of the people on our train died on the train and were just left along the tracks because there was no way to even bury them. But of course, that was like a year and a half later, and these people who were kept alive and on this train were barely living. So if you've ever been in a cattle car, night and day, you don't forget it. Of course, Bergen-Belsen was the place where Anne Frank and her sister were imprisoned, and she passed away there. And this is just a picture of Bergen-Belsen. You can see how bleak it is. Again, very cold. I never saw a flower in Bergen-Belsen. And when I got older, I said that certainly cannot be because there was spring, there's spring all over, and I never heard a bird. I think that you were just so dulled and were so focused on just living from day to day that no kind of beauty entered your head or your eyes or your ears. Okay, so that's Bergen-Belsen. So we'll move on. These were the living conditions. They were barracks, and in the beginning, you never slept one to a bed, but you slept two to a bed. And then when these prison housing got worse and worse, it was three to a bed. And I remember they always fought over my brother and I because these were grown people who loved nothing better than a starving little child to be the third person in the bed. So I remember we were always kind of placed in different beds. And after a while, when it got impossibly cold and there was just nothing, people tore the beds apart and used it for firewood. So it was just a world where if you had any chance to survive, it diminished dramatically as the Bergen-Belsen became more and more crowded. Now, of course, the difference between Bergen-Belsen and, in a way, it was a miracle that we ended up there, and there's a story to that, but that'll have to take another talk. But Bergen-Belsen was not an extermination camp. It was a concentration camp in that it didn't have gas chambers, but tens of thousands of people died from starvation, from slave labor, from having no food. So it had a tremendously high death toll. And my brother and I learned to count because we were outside barracks. Our barracks, all you could see were mounds of skeletons. I mean, mounds of people who had recently died. And my brother and I would try to kind of see how many were in one pile. And, that was as natural to us as putting on the TV in the morning. My brother and I had a game where we killed the lice in our hair. And lice were particularly kind of amusing because as you kill them, they make kind of a cracking sound. And we would see how many we could kill and put in a straight line, which was another way of learning how to add. So, it was a life that was apart from life, but that was our life. And it's, of course, every day I think about that and realize how blessed I've been to have ended up with a wonderful life in a wonderful country, and the importance of in America, a place that was the kind of vision for everyone to go to start a new life, to live in a democracy, not to have to worry that you would end up at night in a prison or off on a train to be exterminated. And so, especially the maintenance of democracy, and we think of that these days, how critical that is and how many people take it for granted. I want to just, that the picture before, I just want to look at this picture. You can't see it clearly, but it goes to show how far you were degraded. I never had a name in the camp except my parents, and some people called us the little twins or the Hess twins. But, when the Nazis, the police officers, the Gestapo, when they saw you, they called you either Schwein, pig, or Hund, dog. So you were nameless and faceless. And you can see here, these are women trying to, I don't know, either put some kind of meal together or peel potatoes. I don't know what fun. But right behind them, there are these dead bodies, hundreds of them. And, it's like that's our world. That is our vision of the world, and that you no longer have the feelings to even pay attention to them or to be moved by their presence. Okay. And so we have the barracks. We can go on from that. Yep. So we came to America in 1947 on the Queen Elizabeth, and I remember that, that was actually a luxury liner where they permitted some refugees to be their passengers. And it was one of the worst crossings of the Queen Elizabeth. It was just stormy and nobody could eat anything, even though the food looked so delicious. But my father, who, and of course all of us realized that we never even seen that kind of food, that we were so privileged to go on this luxurious liner. He always made sure that even if we were kind of terribly nauseous, that we would not miss a meal. And for some reason, the only thing that I loved having there that wouldn't make me nauseous were sardines and anchovies. So people still bring me that as kind of a joke. But here we are in America, and there is my mother, even after all the war, still dressing very elegantly. This was at our new house that we moved into within a year of coming to New York. Okay, the next one. And, this is, visiting Eleanor Roosevelt. That's me. And I'm wearing a Dutch hat here. And this was our first car, a Pontiac, which of course was an amazing happening when we got our first car. My father, when he came to America, when he was in Germany, he was a high executive at a major silk firm. But when he came here, he became a textile traveling salesman. But he was, he was very proud of doing that. And he did it very well. And he loved his car. Okay. This was my brother and I, who my brother was in the Navy. After college, I went to Barnard, he went to Columbia. This was the day of graduation. And we were in almost every newspaper in New York City with one of these headlines, "Far Cry from Bergen-Belsen." Certainly an amazing happening to us all, that from the grave, we kind of reached this stage of having graduated from a wonderful school. Yep. So this is this is in the side picture, but it's just interesting. One of the things that the article in the newspaper elicited was that we discovered the nanny who we loved so much, and who had a sister who was also known as Marion, and was named after me. But then she became a famous model, and she became a model, and she also became a fashionable designer. And so I just learned that about 2 years ago, and it was so interesting to me. He was someone who was named after me, and was this glamorous person. It was kind of touching and amusing. Here's my brother and me a few years ago, and this is a blanket that from Bergen-Belsen, which I still have, which is kind of one of the very few possessions from those horrific years in the concentration camp. Yeah, I think that's it. So I thank you, and I'm eager to hear your questions.
Oh, well, thank you, Marion, so much for
Oh, yes,
sharing your.
yes, I just want 2 minutes because I
Sure.
forget it. But I think it's kind of such an amazing summary of everything I've spoken about. When my mother passed away, and she was a remarkable person, we discovered that she had written some poems, and they were all autobiographical, but we didn't know that she had written these poems after she passed away. And so, and some of them were just amazing. And so we collected them in this little book that's never been published. We just gave them out at her memorial service. And my mother, because of the war, was almost blind. She had typhus and all the kinds of diseases. So she had very, very challenged vision. So this is a picture. I don't know if you can see it. She always wore dark glasses. But one of the poems was "Ode to My Eyes." And it goes like this. I lived 3 lives. 3 times I died. You wonder why I can't sleep at night. Very often I think my eyes are fine. Just saw too much to really shine. Instead of beauty, they had to see what men could do to history. Instead of watching the golden sun rise, they had to look at madmen's eyes. Instead of weeping real tears, their tears dried up before their years. They worked the hardest, desiring the best. That's what they got by taking a rest and seeing only what they wanted to see. I carry them, but they own me. They punished and haunted me for all the horrors they had to see. Since they could have given up on me years ago, I am grateful to them, not quite happy though. Yet as a reward in a valiant fight, they now and again let me read and write. In their eyes, they let me win this fight. So we made a peace. Whatever will be, they promised to always stay with me as long as I'll go with them instead of they with me.
Beautiful. What a treasure to have her words, to know what she was thinking. So Marion, we have several questions coming in, and I have several questions I'm dying to ask you. But the first is, what do you attribute giving you and your family strength through all the darkness?
Well, that's a good question. And, there are really no specific, well, yes, there are. I mean, first, my parents, I think because they had two children, um, they they had kind of a special um, passion and to do the best they can, and of course to have us live and survive this horror. The chances that we would were very slim. My parents, after all, they made the decision that we would be together. Many children were separated, many children were put into hiding. And my parents, they were very sophisticated and they had the means. But they decided that we would stay together, that whatever happened, we would be together, which in itself was courageous, but of course, a certain uh, responsibility. I absolutely, absolutely believe that if something had happened to my parents, that my brother and I would not have survived. The light would have gone out immediately. And if something had happened to the two of us, my parents wouldn't have survived. I think somehow just being together. And my parents, I mean, they weren't idealistic, but they were realistic, but they also were they were kind of strategic, and none of these are survival tools, but they had a certain spirit. They never gave up. My mother, who was a young woman, had enormous inner strength, and they endured. And I think it was just they were all together. And of course, in the end, it's luck. But there were so many people in the camp who, when we used to call them Muslimen, and that's actually in the dictionary, people who saw what was in store and just gave up. And they were just so overwhelmed and so weakened that they were just very vulnerable, and many of these people didn't last very long. But my parents, they had the courage, they had the strength, they had the spirit, and um, they were blessed.
Marion, didn't your father originally, your mother and you and your brother were taken, and then your father turned himself in to be with you? That's how much they wanted to be together.
Yep, yep. My father had blonde hair, blue eyes. He was, the quintessential Nazi-looking person, certainly not Jewish. And he spoke German fluently. So when people were gathered in Amsterdam, when you were picked up, you were taken to something called the Concertgebouw, or the Schouwburg, which was a converted theater. from there they were taken to the trains. And my father was kind of enlisted. He didn't have a choice to work there, and because he spoke German, and he actually was heroic there because he was able to save many people, to kind of sneak them out. But when we were picked up, my father was not with us. He was working in the suburb. And when he realized that we were picked up, he gave up. He said, I don't want, I have to go to my family. And there's a story about him, which is true. It's in his memoir we went to the camp in a cattle car, and they put him in like a first class train.
Oh,
I
my
think,
goodness.
what a foolish man or something. Yep.
It was very brave, though. Incredibly brave. Um, and another person from the audience asked, can you speak about your liberation and how you were able to come to America? You left Bergen-Belsen, right? We didn't cover that part, but maybe speak a little bit about that.
Well, we were in Bergen-Belsen and for over a year. But then, the Germans saw the writing on the wall. They were losing the war. And by that time, Bergen-Belsen was unlivable. People were dying 10,000 a day because of typhus, and it just became an unlivable place. And the Nazis wanted to hide the evidence because they thought it was imminent when the Allies would come and find the camp or liberate the camp, although they didn't know exactly when and where, but they knew that it would happen soon. And so they took about 6,000 people, survivors who were barely alive, and put them on 3 trains. Nobody knew where the trains were going. It turned out that one was liberated very soon after by Americans, and a second train left and also was liberated. But our train was called the Lost Train. And what happened there was, because there was so much bombing and chafing of or shelling of trains, that none of the trains could move. And so we were always the train would go for one day, a half a day, and then it would kind of couldn't move because there was so much traffic on just one track. And so this train was called the Lost Train, much has been written about it. And it was liberated after 13 days by the Soviets.
Okay.
So, and then we were and it was in a small farming village, Turbis, where I said on this train, a third of the people had died, so they never even made it. And then so many people died afterwards because there was just a terrible typhus epidemic. And so then, we didn't have a choice where we would end up because, nobody wanted to take. There were people without a country. The Dutch really didn't want to take us at all because they still hated the Germans, even though we had just come back from a camp. So, that's how and then we finally got to America. All of these things have longer kind of stories, but this is
Right.
shorthand.
Oh, thank you. Faris, a question for you. The biography of the family, it's not just their story. You've interwoven a wealth of information on Hitler's rise to power and the persecution of the Jews and the defeat of the Nazis. How did you decide to format the book this way? And what do you hope audiences will take away from this history?
So I covered that a little bit in the talk. I thought that I could not possibly write it without the military and cultural history that resulted in the twins' the Hess family's horrible experience in the Holocaust. So it really wasn't for me. That's how I'm a historian by training, And I didn't feel that you could tell the story and extract the family from what caused all their problems, and what was going on in the world. And I felt that it was really essential for people to know the whole story. Some Holocaust stories that I've heard are in rightfully important memoirs. Just, this is what I did, this is what happened, and then this is what happened to me. But you don't understand in many of those stories why it happened, how it happened.
Right.
So I felt it was a way of really bringing the story right to a reader, the whole situation, so no one can experience it but those who went through it, but at least they would have some sort of empathy for how it could have happened, and hopefully recognize what's possible in this world, both for evil and for good.
Right. Faris, based on your scholarship and knowledge of the history, were there some Western European countries that acted differently, where there were better survival rates for Jews than in the Netherlands? Speaking of, the
Yes.
importance of doing something.
Yes. That's a really tragic piece of history, that the Hesses chose Amsterdam because of its history during World War I. However, the Netherlands was actually, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the Netherlands. So that, for instance, in France, 75% of the Jews who were there survived. In Belgium, 50% survived. The Dutch have a horrible record of 25% surviving. And only 5% of those who left Holland were able to return.
Wow.
So it's a terrible stain, I think, on Dutch history. And why that happened is complicated. Partly it's the geography. There was really no place for the Jews to run, as there might have, and there was quite a strong Nazi movement in Holland, and especially in Amsterdam. So that the Dutch actually sent brigades of soldiers to fight with the Germans on their Eastern War. So they were trapped in so many different ways. The Jews were trapped by the culture, and they were trapped by the geography. There was really nowhere for them to run. They could not run across the sea. Other countries, in some other countries, the Catholic Church has a record of hiding Jews, but not so much in the Netherlands.
Tragic. You also, go ahead, Marion. Would you like to add?
Yeah, on both those points, just very quickly.
Sure.
First of all, Faris, it's interesting because, I don't take credit for this book at all. I'm honored that Faris, wrote it, and of course, now that the book is written, it's a major part of my life. But when people read the book, and I've gotten so many notes about this, that what differentiates this book from other memoirs is how incredibly helpful it is that it was put in historical context.
Right.
So that, and even my father, I mean, when he wrote his memoirs and his letters within a year of being liberated, and it's an amazing memoir because it's so direct. But he nobody knew what was going on in the rest of the world. You know, what part of the puzzle, what part of the conflict Holland was in, and how did this happen? You know, Bergen-Belsen story, and so it's also wonderful and makes it, I think, so much more valuable. That it is an amazing historical kind of work, and which is very, very important, and
Yeah.
makes it, you know, much more long lasting. And I think that's true. Um, you know, the Dutch are interesting and true. They had a terrible record, and you know, in the last few years, as it has come out, that the Dutch, you know, rather than being the world of Anne Frank and saving the Jews, they were quite to the contrary. Uh, and people who were sent to the camp, actually only 5% survived, because the overwhelming amount were finally sent to Auschwitz, which were death camps. So, uh, so they, you know, they did have a terrible record, which has, you know, their Holocaust Museum, which is quite a wonderful museum, only opened last year, and it's really worthwhile seeing. And the reason why it's taken so long, because the Dutch really had trouble revealing or kind of fessing up that their history was much more fraught than the world believed. But if you go to Holland, Amsterdam, it's worth seeing, because it's interesting how they've dealt with it, and um, you know, that part of it.
Mhm. Well, I love the book, the way the book was written, because it's got the historical accuracy, but we also learn best from stories, you know, and have more empathy when we focus on one family. Faris, I mean, I know why I'm drawn to the Hess story, but I wonder if you could share what drew you to tell the Hess family story.
Um, of course, it was the family itself.
Yeah.
This is a most unusual family. Carl, he risked his life to help, and was terribly beaten. The guards thought they had killed him for allowing people in his work detail to have a short rest. When that was discovered, he was just almost killed, and the guards thought he was dead. He was reported as dead, which is why his family in America thought he died. Um, and Ilse's courage also was just so remarkable. At one point in her testimony, at one of the places she gave some testimony, she said, "I woke up every day saying I will defeat the entire German army."
Wow.
Wow is right. And this was when people were dying all around her. And later she said, "I think I survived to tell this story." So with those kinds of people, it's a story, I think, that speaks to everyone on so many levels. It's an inspiration, and I just felt it was a story that would be timeless and would matter in the world.
Absolutely. Well, we're very, very grateful that you shared this history. I wanted everyone to know that the museum is selling copies of Inseparable through our online store. So you could go on this afternoon and order it through the link. And Faris and Marion are signing book plates that will be in the books that we will ship to you. So it will be personalized, and then you can read more of this fascinating story. We're almost out of time, so I wanted to ask you both to reflect on 81 years after liberation. Why is it still so important to continue to teach the history of the Holocaust? Why do we need to continue making sure that people really hear these stories and understand the consequences?
Marion?
Um, well, you know, I have to tell you briefly, when the last time I saw my father, he was on his deathbed. And he said, I have three things to say to you. And this was in 1981, so it wasn't just last year, it was a long time ago. And he said, take good care of mommy. That was my wonderful mother, Ilsa. And the second thing, he talked about Israel, and he said, I'm worried about Israel because that was always our dream in the camp, that the Jews would have a country where they would feel safe and comfortable. And he said, I'm worried about the long-term survival of Israel because it's surrounded by enemies, and there's little recourse there. So that was his concern about Israel. But then the third was in 1981, he said, I'm worried about democracy. He said, democracy is so precious. It gave us another life. But I'm worried that people don't honor it. He says, democracy is frail and you have to work at it. Otherwise, it's taken away. And I remember that, I understood his first two comments, but the last one, democracy, because now I think of it all the time. And, I know these days politics are fraught and people talk about, Hitler and everything that's happening. We can argue a long time about, is that the case, how close it is the case. But you can certainly see when the guardrails of democracy, when the guardrails of the of honesty, the rule of law, the rule of civility, or the spirit of humanity, when that starts to unravel, you could see, it's not, it'll never happen again, which everyone said, but it can certainly happen again. So it's so, so important not to forget history and to learn from it. Not everyone is a hero, but I think education and just knowing about these chapters of history and what you can learn from them is something that is more important than ever.
We're here. Faris,
Yes,
do you have anything you want
I
to add?
agree. I agree 100% with what Marion is saying, of course. And what drew me to their story was their courage, their love for each other, their kindness in the world, and their determination, even at risk to themselves, to help those that they could. At really great risk. And I felt as I wrote that and continue to believe in these times, which are quite tumultuous right now, that their story about the power of individuals to make a difference in the world is what we need more than ever right now. As Ilsa said, I think I survived to tell the story. I think she knew that there was a purpose for their story to be told, and that it could inspire people to do what's right, to be courageous, and always to value the freedoms that we have.
Wow, I couldn't end on better words. I thank you both for being with us. Marion, thank you for sharing your story. Faris, thank you for documenting the story. And thank all of you for being with us today. As always, we are really grateful that you're a part of our museum family and that you are along this journey of learning with us. Stay safe and stay warm, and I hope to see you all in person soon.